On the 2nd of September 1942, the skies had cleared and the Luftwaffe was back in action. They concentrated their efforts against Soviet airfields as well as other targets, shattering the spirits of the Soviet air crews. Morale was so low for the Soviet 8th Air Army that one lieutenant defected and flew his aircraft to a German airfield. Still, the Soviet Air Force helped delay the start of the 24th Panzer Division's attack, which also suffered under artillery and mortar strikes and was hampered by muddy roads. The advance began at 0930 hours, and strangely enough, the 24th Panzer Division's reconnaissance units found no enemy at all in their wake. This was because both Lopatin and Shumilov had withdrawn their units into their defensive lines west of the city. So the advance proceeded smoothly with little trouble, and 24th Panzer Division had reached its daily objectives by about noon. They did want to go further, but due to a solid line of Soviet defenders, and because 14th Panzer Division was slow to catch up, they had no choice but to wait. Strong enemy forces with artillery and tanks in Pashanka, tank trench and positions east of Alexeyevka, heavily occupied by anti-tank guns and anti-tank rifles. The initial rearward movement of the enemy to the east during the day stopped in the afternoon. As this was happening, the 71st Infantry Division and the Romanian 20th Infantry Division advanced towards each other and now linked up. For the first time in the Stalingrad campaign, Paulus' 6th Army and Hoth's 4th Panzer Army were now together, which would mean that they could better cooperate and coordinate their forces against their enemy. Sadly though, for the Axis, their encirclement captured almost nothing because the Soviets had already withdrawn. This withdrawal had saved huge portions of the 62nd and 64th Armies, but the haste of it had prevented the Soviets from constructing in-depth defences, and the fortifications in the western and southern parts of the city were still incomplete. But it was clear that the opportunity to encircle portions of Yeremenko's forces had been lost, and there was now only one course of action for the Axis. Henceforth, the Germans had no choice but to contemplate a major struggle to capture the city of Stalingrad. Gone were the days of rapid thrusts across the steppe and encirclements of enemy forces. Now, Paulus issued orders for a direct attack on the city of Stalingrad, even though the 14th Panzer Corps was ordered to continue holding on to its northern front, and Paulus's other units were not really in a position to start this attack yet. To assist in this struggle though, the Luftwaffe Field Regiment attached to 71st Infantry Division was reinforced by more Luftwaffe units, and now became known as Kampfgruppe Starhill, commanded by Rainer Starhill. This guy had an interesting career, going on to be the commander of the city of Warsaw at the start of the Warsaw Uprising. And at the same time, the Soviets were also reinforcing their defences. Yeremenko informed Lopatin that reinforcements were on their way across the Volga, with the 4,500 sailors of Batrakov's 42nd Rifle Brigade arriving that evening. Afanasev's 244th Rifle Division and the supporting 20th Destroyer Brigade were also to be taken from Shumilov and given to Lopatin to strengthen the line in the face of Paulus's attack. As these moves happened, 4th Tank Army launched an attack against 8th Army Corps' defences, hoping to cause a distraction. However, this attack, led by the 214th, 27th Guards and 298th Rifle Divisions against the 384th and 76th Infantry Divisions, failed completely and didn't cause the wanted distraction. Worse, Moskalenko wasn't able to concentrate his forces in time for the upcoming attack in the Kotluban area. At first, Zhukov postponed the attack to later in the morning, then realised that this still wasn't enough time, so had to delay it again until 0500 hours the next day, the 3rd of September. And at this point, it really did look like it would be too late to save the city. It seemed to everyone on both sides that Stalingrad was about to fall. Hitler was already planning for this. He is reported to have said at the Situation Conference on the 2nd of September 1942 that when the city is entered, the entire male population is to be liquidated because Stalingrad, with its population of 1 million, all of it communist, was particularly dangerous. I know that some people don't think that Hitler would say such a thing because they believe that he was just an innocent bystander in World War II who got blamed for all the atrocities. Well, the official German history does clarify that Hitler did say the word liquidated, or at the very least something similar. Halder reported that Hitler used the word annihilated, which is the same sort of thing. But regardless of the actual word used, the Führer order was weakened by the OKH and/or Army Group B before it was passed on to the 6th Army, which would read the word evacuated instead. And this is a good example of where the National Socialists or the Wehrmacht would hide their true intentions by using masked language. So yes, the male population of Stalingrad would die and the female population would be deported, most likely to the slave labour camps of the Reich. This was why it was important for the Soviets to evacuate the city, which they were also doing right now. This evacuation took up a lot of transport space, which hindered the mobility of the Red Army during this time. At the same time, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR had decided to order the evacuation of the Volga Germans, sending them to Siberia and Kazakhstan. Among the German population that is living in the Volga regions are thousands and tens of thousands of diversionaries and spies, who, upon a given signal from Germany, are to conduct demolitions in areas occupied by the Volga Germans. This order had been issued on the 28th of August, but now, on the 2nd of September 1942, the evacuations began. Yes, many thousands of lives were being disrupted by the fighting for the Stalingrad region. When Afanasyev's division arrived before dawn on the 3rd of September, Lopatin ordered it to reinforce the 196th Rifle and 33rd Guards Rifle divisions. Here, Afanasyev was to plan a counterattack against the incoming German attack. Well, he didn't have long to wait. 14th Panzer Division attacked eastwards, overrunning elements of 33rd Guards Rifle Division and the 20th Destroyer Brigade, but was stopped at around 0600 hours as a result of flanking fire from the village of Pashanka and the Three Hill Trench. The 36th Panzer Regiment lost 14 panzers in the fighting for this area and would actually be out of action for the next few days in order to repair its tanks. Then, shortly after this, at 0700 hours, reconnaissance forces from the 24th Panzer Division made contact with the 191st Infantry Regiment of 71st Infantry Division north of Potomnik. Then, their main attack started at 0800 hours. Edelsheim conducted an attack along the railway, drawing enemy fire. But it was a feint attack. The main attack came from Kampfgruppe Broik, which advanced from the north and struck the Soviet flank, enabling them to reach the hill near Pashanka. As this was happening though, Soviet artillery and mortar fire rained down upon the division and, at 0855 hours, 24th Panzer Division reported to Corps, Division Commander lightly wounded, Brigade Adjutant wounded, Oberst von Nostitz severely wounded. Yes, Hounschelt had been visiting the front line when a piece of shrapnel had struck him in the head. Luckily, it was only a grazing wound which was quickly dressed by a medic, and before long, Hounschelt had the telephone receiver in his hand, continuing to direct the assault of his units. The commander of the 89th Panzer Artillery Regiment, Nostitz-Walwitz, was also wounded and was replaced by one of his battalion commanders, Major Hans-Walter von Pavel. However, this was only a temporary arrangement. A new regiment commander was needed and was sought for from the wider Wehrmacht. At the same time, the division was still looking for a replacement commander for the 24th Panzer Regiment as well. The division had their eye on the very famous Oberstleutnant Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz von Großzeuger unter Kamenetz, currently fighting along the Volga north of Stalingrad at the head of his panzer battalion in 16th Panzer Division. To their north, Seydlitz's corps also attacked, hoping to advance towards the centre of Stalingrad. The 295th and 71st Infantry Divisions struck east, with Wuttmann's men forcing the 23rd Tank Corps and the 112th and 399th Rifle Divisions back from the Konaya and Gumrak stations, taking both in the process. Hartmann's troops battled the forward regiments of Ermolkin's 112th Rifle Division and savaged them heavily, along with the two supporting tank brigades from 2nd Tank Corps. The 191st Infantry Regiment also overran Ivanov's 196th Rifle Division, capturing Opatnaya Station, which is roughly where the N of the word Stalingrad is on the map. It was only when Kartsev marched in with his 87th Rifle Division that Hartmann's advance was slowed, but Kartsev's division was battered in the process of holding Hartmann back. By this point, 24th Panzer Division's advance had also slowed to a crawl as heavy artillery and mortar fire, plus dug-in Soviet tanks, caused the German grenadiers to fall back slightly. So, German artillery was called upon to pound these Soviet positions, weakening the Soviet will to hold on, and it soon became clear to the Germans that the defenders were preparing for another withdrawal, and had in fact started to do so. As a result, by the end of the day, the villages of Alexeyevka and Krutienki had fallen to the 24th Panzer Division, itself whittled down to 36 panzers, and had taken 143 casualties in the process. Meanwhile, it had been decided that the 29th Motorized Division should come to 14th Panzer Division's aid. 71st Infantry Regiment, supported by the 9 operational panzers of Petch's 129th Panzer Battalion, launched an attack on the Three Hill Trench area at 1500 hours. However, Soviet artillery and Katyusha rocket fire soon brought this assault to an end as well. Wittersheim also launched an assault from the north with some of his forces. Small Kampfgruppen from 16th Panzer and 3rd and 60th Motorized Divisions pushed south against Group Gorokov. But the Soviet lines held firm due to the fact that the bulk of these German divisions were facing north at this time, dealing with Zhukov's attack to the north, which we'll cover shortly. So, as you can see, this was when a large Soviet-held bulge, the Orlovka salient, began forming in the north of the city of Stalingrad, which would turn out to be a thorn in the side of the Germans for quite some time. But while the Germans had been stopped on the ground, they hadn't been stopped in the air. As they had for Paulus's arrival, German bombers proclaimed the coming of Hot with yet another massive bombing raid over Stalingrad on September 3rd. A 24-hour relentless raid against the already ruined city, this crushing attack, similar in scale to that of the 23rd of August, destroyed 64th Army's command centre and almost killed Churikov. Churikov continued working as dust and soil poured through the cracks in the roof of the headquarters dugout as bombs pummeled them for several hours. But he and the staff at 64th Army headquarters ignored the bombs and carried on answering telephones and issuing orders. Suddenly, our dugout seemed to be thrown into the air. There was a deafening explosion. Abramov and I found ourselves on the floor, together with the overturned desks and stools. Above us was the sky, choked with dust. Lumps of earth and stones were flying about, and around us people were crying out and groaning. When the dust had settled a little, we saw an enormous crater some 6 to 10 yards from our dugout. Round it lay a number of mutilated bodies, and scattered about were overturned trucks and our radio transmitter, now out of action. Our telephone communications had also been destroyed. The main headquarters of the 64th Army had been destroyed, but another signals post was nearby. Churikov set off in a truck towards it, chased by a Stuka. Dodging its bombs, he managed to reach the signals post and re-established contact with the army's units. Clearly though, 62nd and 64th Armies were in trouble. But don't worry, they weren't alone, and Zhukov was going to help them. On the 3rd of September 1942, the strength of Army Group B was roughly 980,000 men. Of these, there were 580,000 German and 400,000 Allied troops. Army Group A's strength was 300,000 men, including both German and Allied soldiers. This means that, despite the necessity of getting the oil of the Caucasus, the priority for the Axis had shifted to the long northern flank, which needed to be stabilised. Of the 980,000 men of Army Group B, 425,000 troops belonged to the Italian 8th, German 6th, and German 4th Panzer armies. These faced the Stalingrad and southeastern fronts, which had 8 armies in total and 470,000 men at the front. But there were another 80,000 men behind the lines under their command for a total of 550,000. In addition, according to Glantz, the 6th Army had roughly 250 tanks, and the 4th Panzer Army had 300 tanks on the 3rd of September 1942. The Soviets in their area had between 550 and 650 tanks, and the Red Army Air Force had 226 aircraft compared to the Luftwaffe's 950. Personally, when it comes to the equipment at least, I think he's overstated the numbers on both sides, but I haven't got any better numbers, so we'll just have to go with it for now. It's interesting though that while the Soviets had more troops, they didn't outnumber the Axis by considerable amounts. They didn't outnumber the Axis by multiple times their own number. Instead, they had an extra 50 to 100,000 men, which is a lot, but the Axis were definitely not outnumbered by 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 or anything like that. What was happening was the Soviets were getting drip-fed more reinforcements than the Axis, but were using these in desperate counter-attacks or getting them destroyed in hopeless encirclements rather than building up correctly for a major and properly planned counter-offensive. They did this for a number of reasons, including desperation, but regardless of the reason, the Red Army didn't always vastly outnumber the Axis at this stage of the war. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because, by reading the German accounts, you get the impression that the Soviets sent in wave after wave and horde after horde of men and tanks against the Axis, but in reality, it wasn't quite like that. Yes, having an extra 100,000 troops on the field of battle may have allowed them to concentrate in one area and give the impression to the Germans that they were facing unlimited hordes, but the same could be said for the Soviet side. We've seen previously that Hott had shifted his forces and sent the 48th Panzer Corps plus Romanian troops against the 126th Rifle Division. I'm sure to the men of the 126th Rifle Division it would have seemed like they were facing hordes of Germans, and they were, but only on the tactical or operational level. Both sides had the capability of shifting forces around to form spear points that could pierce and overwhelm certain sections of the front. But in the early part of the war, it was the Germans who managed to do this successfully, whilst the Red Army only managed it later. Now, on the 3rd of September 1942, there was a reason that the Soviets had gathered an extra load of men and tanks, and that was because they were about to launch a new offensive in the Kotluban area north of Stalingrad. Zhukov, Deputy Supreme Commander of the Soviet Union, was in charge, and his plan was for the Stalingrad front to simply smash their way through to Stalingrad. And it's worth pointing out at this juncture that Glantz is really the only author to actually cover the Kotluban battles in detail. There are others, Isaev and Mark especially, but glance covers the whole event and is by far the most detailed, so a lot of the information in this video comes from volume 2 of his Stalingrad series. So if you want more info, that's the book you need to get. Anyway, the newly formed 24th and 66th Armies had been sent in as reinforcements, meaning from east to west, the Stalingrad front now had Malinovsky's 66th Army, Moskalenko's 1st Guards Army, Kozlov's 24th Army, and Kryuchunkin's 4th Tank Army all ready to attack. At least in theory. In reality, the desperate situation at Stalingrad had required an attack to be launched as quickly as possible in order to ease the pressure on Soviet forces in the city. This meant, of course, that just like every other Soviet attack so far, Zhukov's offensive was going in before it was properly prepared. Whereas, just like every other Soviet attack so far, the forces would go in a piecemeal fashion. In fact, only one army would actually go in on the first day of the attack, and that was 1st Guards Army. And Moskalenko faced impossible problems. The forces transferred to him from Group Kovalenko had already suffered heavy losses during the previous fighting. His 6 already committed rifle divisions had lost up to 1/3 of their strength, and the 2 tank corps had lost 250 of their 350 tanks. There was a shortage of artillery pieces, and a good portion of their anti-tank guns were the weak 45mm models. Plus, many of Moskalenko's new units had had to travel up to 200 kilometers just to reach their new positions, and many had only arrived the night before, meaning that they were both fatigued before the attack had even begun and had no time to prepare for it. Despite the daunting challenges Moskalenko and his fellow army commanders faced, orders were orders, and at this stage of the war it was not healthy to question superiors. As he had done at Leningrad in September 1941 and at Moscow in November 1941, Zhukov had no choice but to carry out Stalin's orders. He did so with characteristic ruthlessness and abandon. Now, we just need to clarify something here. When Wittesheim raced to the Volga in late August, the Soviets had counterattacked in the Kotluban region. However, that attack was classed as a counter-offensive. Zhukov's latest attack on the 3rd of September wasn't a counter-offensive. It was the first offensive in the area. So the first Kotluban attack should probably be called the Kotluban counter-offensive, whereas this attack is now known as the first Kotluban offensive, even though it confusingly wasn't the first attack in the area, nor the last. Anyway, at 0200 hours on the 3rd of September 1942, Moskalenko began his attack with a pathetic 30-minute artillery bombardment that did little to the German forces. Then, at 0300 hours, 3 divisions, each supported by a tank corps with this many tanks each, advanced towards the German lines. The men crossed flat terrain, scarred by ravines and gullies, with not a tree in sight, and were hit by effective artillery, tank and air fire, whilst German infantry ambushed them from positions of concealment. The main attack came in from the middle, with the 116th Rifle Division and the 7th Tank Corps, which had 150 of the 250 tanks in this offensive. On paper, this attack looked impressive, but in reality, the 116th Rifle Division lagged behind and gave little support to Rotmistrov's 7th Tank Corps. In addition, Rotmistrov's Tank Corps wasn't fully prepared, with its Rifle Brigade starting this battle at just 30% strength. So this lagged behind in the second line, along with the 87th Tank Brigade, as the 3rd Guards and 62nd Tank Brigades went into combat first under the cover of artillery and Katyusha fire. 8th Grenadier Regiment of the 3rd Motorised Division stood in their way, and it was their PaK anti-tank and 88mm flak guns, plus Reinhardt's panzers and effective Luftwaffe support that absolutely hammered the incoming Soviet tanks. The lack of anti-aircraft guns on the Soviet side didn't help matters, with Stukas having almost unrestricted access to their prey. Yet, despite all the odds, Moskalenka's forces managed to advance 4 kilometers into the German front. But then their attack was ground down and came to a halt, mainly as a result of German artillery and anti-tank fire, according to Isaev. Rotmistrov lost 53 tanks either knocked out or destroyed in the process. 3rd Motorized Division reported the loss of 75 men killed, 178 wounded, and 14 men missing in the day's actions. While this attack did little on the ground, it did divert German aircraft and artillery forces to the area in order to stop it, which prevented their use against Stalingrad. It also forced 3rd and 60th Motorized Divisions to shift forces from their southern flank to help with the defense. This meant that neither 60th or 3rd Motorized Divisions were able to assist Seilitz's 51st Army Corps in their assault on Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe, though, did decide to bomb Stalingrad today, with more bombs than they had dropped on the 23rd of August. And this bombing run lasted 24 hours, leading Yeremenko to believe that defeat was imminent. He even managed to convince Stalin that the end was near, at which point Stalin sent a gloomy telegram to Zhukov. The situation at Stalingrad has worsened. The enemy is situated 3 kilometers from Stalingrad. He can take Stalingrad today or tomorrow unless the northern group of forces renders immediate assistance. Demand the commanders of the forces standing north and northwest of Stalingrad attack the enemy immediately and go to the assistance of the Stalingraders. No sort of delay is permissible. Procrastination now is equivalent to a crime. Throw all of your aircraft in to assist the Stalingraders. Very few aircraft remain in Stalingrad itself. Immediately report receipt and measures taken. Yes, Stalin wanted all the forces north of Stalingrad to attack, and he wanted them to attack now. A hasty decision, but clearly one born of desperation. Knowing that his forces weren't ready for this, Zhukov rang Stalin to protest. Stalin then asked Zhukov if he thought the Germans would wait until he was ready to attack. Regardless whether they were ready or not, Stalin demanded action and only allowed a delay until the 5th of September because ammunition supplies for the attack had not yet arrived. Then, on the 5th, he said everything must be thrown in. If the enemy starts a general offensive against the city, you must attack at once, even if you are not fully prepared. Your main task now is to divert the German forces from Stalingrad and, if possible, wipe out the corridor. So, the attack would continue, driven by despair and the fear of losing the city of Stalingrad. On the 4th of September 1942, the 16th Air Army was finally activated, although this was premature. Pavel Stepanov had little to work with, receiving only a handful of aircraft from 8th Air Army itself on its knees, as well as some from the Stavka Reserve. Its task was to support Zhukov's new attack against German forces in the Kotluban area, a task that it simply couldn't do. Realizing the difficult nature of his task, Stepanov chose to step back and asked his more experienced deputy, General Major Stepan Rudenko, to assume the actual leadership of 16th Air Army. Without effective air support, Moskalenka had little choice other than to just send his units in against the unsuppressed German guns, which is what he did. The 84th Rifle Division now moved into position to attack, but as the infantry formed up and the artillery prepared to fire at 0630 hours, the Germans opened up with their own artillery first, wrecking the 116th Rifle Division's infantry and battering the Soviet artillery units. Delayed by this, the Soviets attacked at 0830 hours instead, and it seems that the German bombardment caused the Soviet infantry to keep their heads down since the 7th Tank Corps moved forwards once again without most of its infantry support. Massive Luftwaffe air attacks then shattered the Soviet units, and the offensive faltered before it had even begun. In fact, the Luftwaffe had prevented the Soviet attacks west of the Milch farm from even happening, with only minor skirmishes occurring there. 84th Rifle Division did take some ground, and around 75 tanks did manage to advance quite far into the German lines, but were halted by the 53rd Motorcycle Battalion and flak gun elements. To the south, other Soviet forces tried to help as well. Having realised that the western flank needed propping up, Kravchenko's 2nd Tank Corps had moved its 27th and 99th Tank Brigades westwards to the Gumrak area to strengthen the remnants of the 87th, 98th and 112th Rifle Divisions. But elements of this corps still launched an attack northwards, achieving some ground against 60th Motorized Division. However, they were forced to fall back later in the day. Thus, Zhukov's attack wasn't going so well. Isayev argues, though, that, more than anything else, it was the copious amounts of German artillery fire that brought the Soviets to a halt. Either way, by the end of the second day, 7th Tank Corps alone had lost 1,302 men and 22 tanks, bringing the total to 77 knocked out tanks for the 2 days of fighting. 3rd Motorized Division had lost 440 men. The knocked out tanks then became improvised pillboxes. The German soldiers holed up in the tanks, rained a hail of lead on the attackers. Army Group B did report Moskalenka's attack, but denied that it had any influence on Paulus's advance towards Stalingrad, suggesting that Zhukov's first Kotluban Offensive had done little so far to stop them. That's not to say that Paulus's men were having an easy time advancing towards Stalingrad. Clearly, they were not. Having failed to trap anything in a pocket southeast of Kalach, the remaining Axis units in the area, like elements of 71st Infantry Division and Kampfgruppe Starhill, began moving eastwards to rejoin the front line. But despite how it may appear on this map, there doesn't seem to have been a clear front line. And as Worcester's artillery battery marched through a ravine, a Bolka, they came under fire from a Soviet T-34. Turning around in the narrow ravine was out of the question, nor was it feasible to get a howitzer into firing position, so we went forward, putting a larger gap between each vehicle and praying we would get through. To me, it felt like the shells were whistling through the legs of our horses. Luckily for Worcester and his men, the T-34 was firing armour-piercing rounds, not high-explosive. Armour-piercing shells don't send as much shrapnel into the air or cause as much damage to infantry targets as high-explosive shells do. So they all got through without being hit once, and the T-34 withdrew. It was beyond our comprehension that we were not hit once. As this was happening, Yenika's 389th Infantry Division marched up to the Konaya station area to replace Wuttmann's division in the line. This allowed Wuttmann to move south to the Gumrak airfield and station area, where he faced the dregs of Yermolkin's 112th Rifle Division, which was down to just 285 men at this point, but supported by about 35 tanks. These tanks, with little infantry support, would have almost no chance against Wuttmann's division, especially since it was supported by elements of Hartmann's division, including Worcester's battery. An 88mm anti-aircraft gun drove past our emplacements towards the front. From my observation post, I looked out towards Gumrak railway station, in the vicinity of which the 88mm took up position, and quite an unprotected one too. When it began to fire with a flat trajectory at the railway embankment, I noticed the turrets of several T-34s behind the embankment, which were returning fire. It turned into a violent duel, from which the flak gun emerged victorious. Several tanks were burning. Worcester's battery also fired their 15cm howitzers at the embankment, compelling the remaining T-34s to fall back. With their help, Wuttmann and Hartmann's divisions quickly cleared the Soviets from Gumrak airfield and the station area. Hartmann's division had also pushed the 196th and 87th Rifle Divisions back as well, although this had come at a cost. A shell smashed into an artillery limber, with Worcester himself hit in the arm. As a gun commander was joking with him, probably trying to cheer him up, another shell knocked the gun commander off his feet. It turned out that Worcester was only bruised, but the gun commander died of his wounds. This all happened on the 4th of September 1942. I later learned that on this particular day, the brother of my future fiancée had been killed. Well, Worcester's bad day aside, the 71st Infantry Division was now just 5 kilometers east of the suburbs of Stalingrad. And this obviously wasn't good for the Soviets, so Lopatin now ordered a counterattack against Hartmann's division. Afanasiev's 244th Rifle Division was ordered to prepare for this, which it began to do. Slightly further south, Stuka's and Henschel's provided support for Hohenschildt's 24th Panzer Division as it prepared to advance as well. 21st Panzer Grenadier Regiment fired yellow flares up into the air to indicate where they were, but unfortunately, the Soviets decided to mimic them and also fired yellow flares into the air. This tricked the Luftwaffe pilots, who then decided to drop their bombs on the Germans. Some German vehicles were smashed, 2 men were killed, and more were wounded. Worse, the 35th Guards Rifle Division and the 20th Destroyer Brigade offered substantial resistance around Voroponovo, with dug-in and hidden T-34s knocking out some of the German tanks. They managed to capture Voroponovo, but it wasn't possible to go much further. Panzers of 24th Panzer Division reached the edge of the city, but as a consequence of very strong anti-tank, tank and infantry defense from the northern and western edge of the city, basically from all directions, they were withdrawn at 1200 hours. It was not possible for the Panzer Grenadiers to follow because of this strong flanking fire, especially since the neighbours to the south were not able to gain ground as quickly. There were also problems to the north. Heim's now panzerless 14th Panzer Division had stalled before Pashanka, facing stiff Soviet resistance from the 126th and 204th Rifle Divisions. And after a stalled attack in the morning, the 29th Motorized and 94th Infantry Divisions managed to force the 157th and 29th Rifle Divisions and 154th Naval Rifle Brigade to abandon Elki in the morning. Heavy fire from Soviet positions in the forest to the east of the village and the appearance of KV tanks had reduced their advance to a crawl, and their attack ground to a halt. Overall, 4th Panzer Army was in trouble, and the headquarters staff complained to the higher-ups that the lack of spare parts and lubricants to protect against the dusty steppe had reduced the amount of operational panzers down to critical levels. So clearly the assault on Stalingrad was already struggling, and the Germans still hadn't reached the city yet. Any brief hopes that the city might yet be captured on the fly quickly evaporated as probing attacks revealed that the Soviets had every intention of defending it. German forces, seriously weakened by the bitter 2-week struggle just to reach Stalingrad, now faced the daunting task of bitter urban fighting in order to secure it. And this urban fighting was going to be made worse thanks to the Luftwaffe bombing campaign against the city. This photo from the German Federal Archive shows a group of civilians in the ruins of Stalingrad during the September of 1942. It's clear that, even by this stage, the city was completely wrecked. Rubble was everywhere, which would hinder movement and provide the defenders with extra cover during the fighting. But there is a debate about how effective this bombing campaign was in other ways. If the point of the air attacks had been to crack the morale of the defenders and the civilian population alike, it was soon obvious that that had not happened. Well, it may have cracked the morale of the civilian population, since there had been a mass panic and flight from the city in the previous days as the NKVD units moved north. And we've seen quite a few Red Army soldiers so far surrender to the Germans, with tank crews and air crews deserting from the Soviet side. but that may or may not have to do with the bombing campaign itself. However, what we can say is that Soviet morale was low at this moment in time, with even Lopatin, 62nd Army's commander, being in a depressed and pessimistic frame of mind. The Southeastern Front's staff also believed now that the city would fall. We had far too few regular troops at that time, and mobilizing the city's population against the might of the German army was not an effective answer. In reality, we had almost nobody to defend the city with. The only good news was that Zhukov's offensive against Paulus's northern flank had impacted Paulus's thrust on Stalingrad. Glantz argues that the first Kotluban Offensive unravelled von Weich's carefully orchestrated offensive plan. He points out that Paulus had to divert aircraft to the north on the 4th of September, and then, slight spoiler, he had to order Seydlitz to halt on the 5th. So, while the first Kotluban Offensive was a disaster for the Soviet forces involved, who were suffering huge casualties, it did have a desirable result. Despite being just a few miles west of the city's suburbs, exhausted German forces had been forced to stop. In fact, what we've just seen in the past few episodes was the final blitzkrieg, the last movement battle, Bewegungskrieg, for the Axis in the Stalingrad campaign. Now the Axis were committed to an assault on the city of Stalingrad itself. And this was clearly bad. But is all hope lost for the Axis? Did Axis forces still have a chance to take Stalingrad? Can Zhukov's offensive have a bigger impact on them than it already is? And was Lopatin the right man to lead 62nd Army in this fight for the city? We'll find out soon. Thanks for watching, bye for now.